You've been lied to, not maliciously, but systematically. The story of America's founding? Incomplete? The heroes you memorized in school? Only part of the cast. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the architects history forgot, the visionaries whose names vanished but whose ideas built this nation. This isn't revisionist history. This is the complete story. Think about it. You know Washington. You know Jefferson, Franklin, Adams, Madison. These names are carved into marble, printed on currency, taught in every classroom across America. But here's what no one tells you. They weren't working alone. They weren't even the only brilliant minds in the room. In fact, some of the most revolutionary ideas that shaped this nation came from people whose portraits hang in no museums, whose names appear in no textbooks, whose contributions have been systematically erased from our collective memory. Why? That's the question that should keep you up at night. But here's what they don't tell you in textbooks. 3 individuals, whose faces you're about to see, contributed ideas that became the backbone of the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. Yet 99% of Americans have never heard their names. Was it deliberate erasure, political rivalry, or something more insidious about how we choose to remember history? The answer reveals uncomfortable truths about whose stories get told and whose get buried. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about who gets to tell the story afterward. And in America, that storytelling has been remarkably selective. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see America's origins. We're not talking about minor players here. We're not discussing people who made small contributions and were rightfully forgotten. We're talking about architects, visionaries, people whose ideas were so fundamental to the founding that without them, America as we know it might not exist. And yet, their names have been scrubbed from history with surgical precision. This is a documentary about power, about who wields it, who writes about it, and who gets remembered for it. This is about the uncomfortable gap between the mythology we've been taught and the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of how this nation actually came to be. So buckle up, because the truth is far more interesting than the legend. Let me introduce you to the first forgotten founder. Her name is Mercy Otis Warren, playwright, political theorist, historian. While men debated in Philadelphia, Warren was writing the intellectual ammunition for revolution. Her 1772 play, The Adulateur, didn't just mock British tyranny, it provided the philosophical framework for justified rebellion. John Adams called her the most accomplished woman in America. Thomas Jefferson sought her counsel. James Madison corresponded with her regularly. She wrote political satire so cutting, so brilliant, that British officials tried to have it banned. Yet her name appears in exactly 0 high school history textbooks. 0. Think about that for a moment. A woman whose intellectual work influenced the founding fathers themselves, whose plays shaped public opinion toward revolution, whose historical writings documented the birth of the nation, and she's been completely erased from mainstream education. Why? Because acknowledging her contribution would shatter the myth of the all-male founding. It would complicate the narrative. It would force us to admit that women were not passive observers during the Revolution, but active participants in shaping its ideology. Mercy Otis Warren was born in 1628 in Barnstable, Massachusetts. Unlike most women of her era, she received an extensive education, studying alongside her brother, James Otis Jr., who would become one of the Revolution's most passionate advocates. She married James Warren, who would later serve as Paymaster General of the Continental Army. But it was Mercy herself who would make the greatest impact. Her plays were revolutionary in every sense. The Adulator portrayed a corrupt governor, clearly representing Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his cronies. But it wasn't just satire. It was political philosophy disguised as entertainment. Warren argued that when a government becomes tyrannical, the people not only have the right, but the duty to resist. Sound familiar? That's because this exact argument would appear in the Declaration of Independence 4 years later. But here's where it gets really interesting. Warren didn't just influence the men around her. She actively challenged them. When John Adams began supporting the Constitution, Warren publicly opposed it, writing that it concentrated too much power in the federal government and lacked sufficient protections for individual rights. She was one of the leading anti-federalist voices. And you know what? She was right. 2 years later, they added the Bill of Rights, the very protections Warren had demanded. John Adams, to his credit, never forgot her. Even after they had a bitter falling out over politics, Warren criticized Adams's presidency in her history book. Adams eventually reconciled with her. In his later years, he wrote to her, "History is not the province of the ladies." It was a jab, but also an acknowledgement. She had invaded male territory and conquered it. So why don't we know her name? Simple. 19th century historians couldn't fit her into their narrative. They were building a story of masculine heroism, of great men making great decisions. A woman, even one as brilliant as Warren, didn't fit the template. So they quietly removed her from the story, kept her correspondence, archived her plays, and then simply stopped talking about her. But Warren wasn't working alone. She was part of a network, a web of revolutionary thinkers who influenced each other, challenged each other, and collectively shaped the ideas that would become America. And if Warren was erased for being a woman, the next forgotten founder was erased for being too principled. Let me introduce you to George Mason. George Mason wrote the document that Thomas Jefferson essentially copy-pasted into the Declaration of Independence. I'm not exaggerating. 17 days before Jefferson put pen to paper in Philadelphia, George Mason drafted Virginia's Declaration of Rights. It contained the famous line, "All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights." Sound familiar? Jefferson's version, "All men are created equal and possess certain unalienable rights." Mason's document was the template. It was the blueprint. Jefferson refined it, made it more poetic, but the ideas, the revolutionary assertion that rights come from nature, not from government, that was George Mason. But here's what makes Mason's story so tragic and so telling. He refused to sign the Constitution. He was there at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, one of the most influential delegates. He spoke more than any other delegate except James Madison. His ideas shaped the structure of the government, and then, at the very end, he refused to sign. Why? Because the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights. Mason stood in that room and said, "This document gives too much power to the federal government without sufficient protections for individual liberty. I cannot support it." He was vilified for this, called a traitor to the cause, accused of putting his pride above the nation's needs. Guess what happened 2 years later? They added the Bill of Rights, using Mason's exact language from the Virginia Declaration of Rights. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution? That's George Mason's work. Every freedom you take for granted, speech, religion, press, assembly, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. George Mason demanded those protections, and when the Constitution lacked them, he had the courage to say no. And history forgot him because he didn't play political games. He didn't compromise his principles for popularity. He stood alone, was proven right, and then was erased from the narrative because his story was inconvenient. It suggested that maybe, just maybe, the Founding Fathers weren't perfect. That maybe some of their critics had valid points. That maybe the Constitution wasn't divinely inspired, but a flawed document that required immediate correction. The truth is, George Mason was more principled than most of the men we celebrate. He saw the future more clearly than they did. He understood that without explicit protections for individual rights, the government would inevitably overreach. He was right. And we forgot him. Think about what that says about how we remember history. We don't celebrate the prophets. We celebrate the politicians. We don't honor the principled. We honor the pragmatic. George Mason was too good for the founding, and so we wrote him out of the story. And then there's the founder who terrified everyone, Samuel Adams. Not the beer guy, though yes, there's now a beer named after him. The revolutionary, the radical, the man who made independence inevitable. Samuel Adams was too radical for the revolution he started. While George Washington wanted reconciliation with Britain, Adams was organizing the Boston Tea Party. While Thomas Jefferson wrote eloquent words about liberty, Adams was building the grassroots network that made independence possible. While Benjamin Franklin played diplomat, Adams was the agitator, the propagandist, the community organizer who turned colonial discontent into revolutionary fervor. Here's what they don't teach you. Samuel Adams essentially invented modern political activism. He created the committees of correspondence, networks of activists in every colony who communicated, coordinated, and amplified each other's messages. This was the revolutionary Internet. He understood that revolution doesn't start with great men making declarations. It starts with ordinary people becoming convinced that change is necessary and possible. Adams was a master propagandist. When British soldiers killed 5 colonists in the Boston Massacre, Adams turned it into a cause célèbre. He organized annual commemorations, commissioned engravings, wrote inflammatory articles. He understood narrative warfare decades before anyone had terminology for it. The Boston Massacre could have been forgotten as a tragic but minor incident. Adams made it the spark that would ignite a revolution. But here's why we forgot him. After the revolution, Samuel Adams became an embarrassment. His methods, mob action, economic sabotage, relentless propaganda, made the other founders uncomfortable. They wanted a genteel revolution for the history books, one where noble men signed documents and gave speeches. Adams gave them a real revolution, one with tarring and feathering, with destroyed property, with angry mobs. Once independence was won, they wanted to distance themselves from the ugly parts of how they achieved it. So they minimized Samuel Adams. They acknowledged him, but diminished him. They said he was important for organizing, but not for thinking. They painted him as a rabble-rouser, not a philosopher. And slowly, over generations, his name faded from prominence. We remember his cousin John Adams, the president, the diplomat, the statesman. We forget Samuel Adams, the revolutionary who made all of that possible. But here's the truth. Without Samuel Adams, there is no revolution. Washington doesn't cross the Delaware because there's no war to fight. Jefferson doesn't write the Declaration because there's no independence to declare. Franklin doesn't negotiate with France because there's no revolution to support. Samuel Adams created the conditions that made all of it possible. He turned colonial complaints into revolutionary action. And we forgot him because his story is uncomfortable. It reminds us that revolutions aren't won by nice people using polite methods. They're won by radicals willing to break rules, destroy property, and organize mass resistance. That's not the story we want to tell schoolchildren. So we don't. Are you starting to see the pattern? We've covered 3 forgotten founders so far. A woman who was too intellectually powerful. A man who was too principled. A man who was too radical. 3 people whose contributions were absolutely essential to the founding, and 3 people who were systematically erased because they complicated the narrative we wanted to tell about ourselves. But we're just getting started, because these 3 were part of a much larger network of forgotten founders, and that network was far more diverse, far more collaborative, and far more revolutionary than anything you learned in school. Here's where it gets fascinating. These forgotten founders weren't isolated geniuses working alone. They formed networks, intellectual salons, correspondence circles, secret societies. And these networks were where the real revolution was planned, debated, and refined. Mercy Otis Warren's parlor in Plymouth, Massachusetts, wasn't just a home. It was revolutionary headquarters. The men who would become America's leaders gathered there regularly. John and Samuel Adams, both frequent visitors. John Hancock. James Warren, her husband, who served as president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. In that parlor, they debated strategy. They refined messaging. They planned resistance. Mercy wasn't just hosting. She was participating, contributing ideas, challenging their assumptions. Think about that image for a moment. The revolution wasn't just debated in Philadelphia's Independence Hall or Boston's Old South Meeting House. It was debated in a woman's living room, with that woman as an equal participant in the conversation. That image doesn't fit our mythology, so we erased it. George Mason's Gunston Hall in Virginia was another crucial node in the network. Mason hosted the Virginia elite: George Washington, George Wythe, Patrick Henry. They gathered at his estate to discuss political philosophy, draft state constitutions, and plan the future of governance. Mason's ideas about individual rights, about the dangers of concentrated power, about the need for explicit constitutional protections, these ideas were refined through hundreds of conversations at Gunston Hall. Washington absorbed them. Jefferson built on them. Madison codified them. And Samuel Adams? He ran the committees of correspondence, which were essentially the revolutionary internet. Every major town in every colony had a committee. They wrote letters, shared information, coordinated action. When Boston faced a crisis, committees in Virginia and South Carolina knew about it within weeks. They could coordinate responses, apply pressure, amplify messages. This network made the revolution possible because it created a sense of unified colonial identity. No longer were they separate colonies with separate interests. They were a network of resistance with a shared purpose. Now here's what's crucial to understand. The famous founders, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, the ones we celebrate, they were the public faces of this much larger collaborative effort. They were important, yes. They were talented, absolutely. But they weren't working in isolation. They were synthesizing, refining, and articulating ideas that came from this broader network. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he wasn't inventing new concepts. He was drawing from George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights, from Mercy Otis Warren's philosophical arguments about tyranny and resistance, from years of political debate that had circulated through these networks. Jefferson was a brilliant writer. He crafted beautiful, memorable prose. But the ideas weren't his alone. They belonged to the network. This is what we've lost by creating the myth of individual genius. We've lost the understanding that the founding was a collaborative effort, that ideas were refined through debate and challenge, that the documents we revere were collective products of an intellectual movement, not the inspired creations of isolated geniuses. And the network was more diverse than you'd ever imagine. Because it wasn't just wealthy white men debating political philosophy. The revolution touched everyone, and everyone contributed to it in ways large and small. Let me introduce you to Phillis Wheatley, enslaved poet. Yes, you read that right. An enslaved woman whose poetry became some of the most influential revolutionary rhetoric of the era. Wheatley was brought to America from West Africa as a child, enslaved by the Wheatley family in Boston. They recognized her intelligence and educated her, something almost unheard of for enslaved people. She learned Latin, Greek, and English literature. By her teenage years, she was writing poetry that rivaled anything being produced in Europe. In 1773, Wheatley published Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, the first book of poetry published by an African American. But it wasn't just the achievement of publication that mattered. It was the content. Wheatley wrote about liberty, about natural rights, about the hypocrisy of white colonists demanding freedom while enslaving black people. Her work forced the revolutionary generation to confront their contradictions. George Washington read her poetry. Thomas Paine cited her work. The revolutionaries who were crafting arguments about natural rights and universal freedom couldn't ignore the fact that an enslaved woman was making those arguments more powerfully than they were. Wheatley's existence challenged their worldview. Her poetry demanded they reconcile their rhetoric with their reality. Did they fully rise to that challenge? No. The revolution didn't end slavery, but Wheatley planted seeds that would eventually grow into the abolitionist movement. She proved that intelligence, creativity, and moral reasoning had nothing to do with race. Every enslaved person who gained freedom in the decades after the Revolution owed something to Phillis Wheatley, who demonstrated through her own brilliance the injustice of slavery. And yet, how many Americans know her name? How many history classes teach her poetry? We remember Paine's Common Sense and Jefferson's Declaration, but we forget Wheatley's poems, which challenged the Revolution to live up to its own ideals. Then there's Crispus Attucks, first casualty of the Boston Massacre, multiracial man, African and Native American heritage, who was killed by British soldiers on March 5, 1770. Samuel Adams understood immediately that Attucks's death could be weaponized for propaganda. A person of color killed by British tyranny. Adams made sure everyone knew the story. He organized commemorations. He commissioned engravings showing the massacre, with Attucks prominently featured. He turned Attucks into a martyr for the cause of liberty. But here's what's fascinating. Adams was willing to use Attucks's death to inspire revolution, but once independence was won, the founding generation became much less interested in talking about him. Because acknowledging that a black man died first for American freedom raised uncomfortable questions about slavery. It suggested that freedom was universal, not limited to white property owners. So Attucks became a footnote, mentioned briefly and then forgotten, his revolutionary significance minimized. It wasn't until the abolitionist movement in the 19th century that Attucks was reclaimed as an important figure. Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists pointed to Attucks and said, "The first American to die for liberty was a black man. How can you justify slavery in a nation founded on his sacrifice?" Attucks became a powerful symbol again, but only because activists fought to reclaim his story. And then there's the Oneida Nation, Native American allies who fed George Washington's troops at Valley Forge when everyone else had abandoned them. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was the darkest moment of the Revolution. Washington's army was starving, freezing, deserting. The Continental Congress couldn't provide supplies. State governments were hoarding resources. The revolution was on the verge of collapse. And then the Oneida Nation arrived with 600 bushels of corn. They brought food, supplies, and warriors to fight alongside the Continental Army. They didn't have to do this. They could have stayed neutral. They could have sided with the British, who were offering better terms. But the Oneida chose to support the revolutionary cause, and that support might have saved the revolution. What did they get in return? After the war, the new American government seized their lands, forced them onto reservations, and erased them from the founding narrative. The Oneida who saved Valley Forge were betrayed by the nation they helped create. And we don't teach that story because it's ugly. It complicates the mythology. It forces us to confront the fact that even in its birth, America was capable of profound injustice. But here's why these stories matter. Not to make you feel guilty, not to diminish the achievements of the famous founders, but to give you the complete picture. Because when you understand that the founding was a collaborative effort involving women, radicals, people of color, and Native Americans, you understand that America was never supposed to be the property of one group. From the very beginning, it was a collective project, messy and contentious, and gloriously diverse. The famous founders we celebrate? They were synthesizing ideas from this broader network. They were standing on the shoulders of people whose names we've forgotten, and by forgetting those names, we've created a distorted understanding of what the founding actually was. We've turned it into mythology. The lone genius model. The great man theory. Washington, the perfect general. Jefferson, the brilliant philosopher. Franklin, the wise diplomat. These men were important, but they weren't working alone. They weren't even the only brilliant minds in the room. So why did we forget everyone else? Why did we create this mythology of isolated genius rather than acknowledging the messy, collaborative reality? That's what we need to talk about next. Because the erasure wasn't accidental, it was systematic. And understanding why it happened reveals uncomfortable truths about American identity. So why don't we know these names? Why has Mercy Otis Warren been erased? Why is George Mason forgotten? Why did Samuel Adams fade from prominence? Why are Phillis Wheatley, Crispus Attucks, and the Oneida Nation reduced to footnotes? The erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic. And it tells us as much about American identity as the founding itself does. Let's start with the obvious answer. The historians who wrote the first comprehensive histories of the founding had an agenda. They were building a national mythology, not documenting complicated reality. This was the 1800s, and America was trying to figure out what it was. The country had survived its birth, but was now grappling with fundamental questions. What held this nation together? What made Americans American? The answer these historians settled on was a shared story of exceptional founding. They needed heroes, not committees, not networks, not messy collaborations. They needed individual giants whose genius and virtue could inspire national unity. So they created the myth of the Founding Fathers, a small group of extraordinary men whose brilliance made America possible. Everything and everyone who complicated that narrative got trimmed away. Mercy Otis Warren. Too complicated for the narrative. She was brilliant, yes, but acknowledging her would raise questions about women's intellectual capacity, about women's political participation. In the 1800s, American women couldn't vote, couldn't own property in most states, couldn't participate in public life. How do you celebrate a female founding intellectual while maintaining that women should be confined to domestic spheres? You don't. You quietly erase her. The historians acknowledged her existence. They couldn't completely ignore someone so well documented, but they minimized her significance. She became John Adams's correspondent, or James Warren's wife, not a political theorist in her own right. Her plays were mentioned as curiosities, not as serious political philosophy. Her history of the Revolution was noted but not celebrated, and slowly, over generations, she faded from public memory. George Mason? He refused to sign the Constitution. How do you build a mythology around a sacred founding document when one of the most influential delegates said, "No, this isn't good enough"? You can't, so you minimize Mason's role. You acknowledge he was there, but you don't teach students that his ideas shaped the document. You don't emphasize that he was right about the need for a Bill of Rights. You certainly don't celebrate him as a hero, because heroes don't refuse to sign sacred documents. Mason's story was an inconvenience. It suggested that maybe the Constitution wasn't perfect as originally drafted. It suggested that critics might have valid points. It suggested that principled dissent might be more valuable than pragmatic compromise. These were not the lessons 19th century Americans wanted to teach. So Mason became a minor character, mentioned briefly and then forgotten. Samuel Adams? His methods were too radical, too violent, too uncomfortable. Once the Revolution was won and America was trying to present itself as a civilized nation, Adams's tactics became embarrassing. You can't celebrate mob action and property destruction when you're trying to convince European powers that you're a legitimate government worthy of respect and trade. You can't praise propaganda and agitation when you're trying to build stable institutions. So the narrative around Samuel Adams shifted. He remained famous, more famous than Warren or Mason, but his significance was downplayed. He became the organizer rather than the revolutionary. His intellectual contributions were minimized. His role in shaping revolutionary ideology was forgotten. He was reduced to a rabble-rouser, important for starting things, but not for thinking deeply about them. The real intellectual work, the narrative suggested, was done by others. This was deliberate erasure through minimization. Adams was too famous to completely forget, so instead they redefined him, stripping away the parts of his story that were uncomfortable and leaving behind a safe, manageable version. And then there were the people of color and Native Americans. Their erasure was even more systematic because acknowledging their contributions would undermine the entire racial hierarchy that America was built on. Remember, this history was being written in the 1800s, during slavery, during westward expansion, during the systematic displacement and genocide of Native peoples. How do you acknowledge that Black and Native people contributed to the founding while simultaneously enslaving and displacing them? You don't. You erase them. You minimize them. You reduce them to footnotes. Phillis Wheatley? Mentioned as a curiosity. Look, even enslaved people could write poetry, but not as a serious political thinker whose work challenged revolutionary ideology. Crispus Attucks? Mentioned as the first casualty, but not as a symbol whose death raised profound questions about who the revolution was for. The Oneida Nation? Barely mentioned at all, their crucial support at Valley Forge reduced to a sentence or two in specialized texts. This erasure served a purpose. It allowed white Americans to claim exclusive ownership of the founding. It allowed them to say, "We built this nation. This is our achievement, our history, our heritage." Acknowledging that the founding was a multiracial collaborative effort would have undermined that claim. But the erasure goes deeper than individual historians with agendas. It's about the lens through which we've viewed history itself. The 19th century was obsessed with the great man theory, the idea that history is driven by exceptional individuals whose genius and force of will shape events. This theory was popularized by thinkers like Thomas Carlyle, who wrote that the history of the world is but the biography of great men. This lens distorted everything. It made collaboration invisible. It made networks irrelevant. It made the contributions of ordinary people, which is to say, people who weren't wealthy white men in positions of formal power, vanish from the record. The great man theory required heroes, and heroes work alone. They don't need help. They don't draw from broader movements. They simply manifest genius and change the world. This is fundamentally false. Historical change never works this way. Revolutions don't happen because a handful of brilliant men decide to make them happen. They happen because of broad social movements, economic pressures, cultural shifts, and the collective action of thousands or millions of people. The American Revolution wasn't Washington's achievement. It was the achievement of every person who boycotted British goods, who joined a militia, who wrote pamphlets, who organized their communities, who risked their lives and livelihoods for independence. But the great man theory can't acknowledge that, so it erases it. It takes the messy, complicated, collaborative reality of historical change and reduces it to a handful of names and dates that can be memorized for standardized tests. And here's the really insidious part. This erasure isn't just about the past. It shapes how we think about the present. When we believe that history is made by great individuals, we become passive. We wait for the next great leader to fix our problems. We don't organize. We don't participate. We don't believe that ordinary people can shape events. We've been taught that we can't, because history is made by exceptional individuals, not by collective action. The forgotten founders contradict that narrative. Mercy Otis Warren wasn't a formal leader. She had no official position, but her ideas shaped the revolution. Samuel Adams wasn't a general or a president, but his organizing made independence possible. Phillis Wheatley was enslaved. But her poetry challenged the revolution's hypocrisy. The Oneida Nation were outsiders to colonial society, but they saved Washington's army. These stories teach us that everyone can contribute to historical change. That genius isn't limited to people in positions of formal power. That collaboration and networks matter more than individual brilliance. That movements, not heroes, change the world. But we've been systematically taught the opposite. We've been taught to worship individual genius, to wait for great leaders, to believe that ordinary people don't matter. And that teaching serves power. It keeps people passive. It prevents collective action. It maintains existing hierarchies. So the erasure of the forgotten founders isn't just about correcting historical inaccuracies. It's about challenging a worldview. It's about understanding that the story we've been told about America's founding is incomplete and deliberately so. The people who wrote that story had reasons for the choices they made. They were building a mythology that served specific purposes. And that mythology has shaped American identity for 2 centuries. But here's the good news. Mythology can be challenged. Incomplete stories can be completed. Forgotten names can be remembered. The historical record still exists. The letters, the documents, the evidence. It's all there. Modern historians have been doing the work of excavation, bringing these forgotten founders back into the light. And that brings us to the final question. Why does this matter now? Why should you care about founders who were forgotten 200 years ago? Because the debate over who gets to define America, whose history counts, which voices deserve platforms, that debate is more urgent now than it's been in generations. And understanding the forgotten founders isn't academic. It's essential to that debate. But here's why this matters in December 2025. We're living through intense debates about American identity, about whose history counts, about which voices deserve platforms, about who gets to define what America is and what it should be. These aren't abstract debates. They're playing out in school boards, in state legislatures, in Supreme Court decisions, in protests and counter-protests. Some people argue we should teach a straightforward, celebratory version of American history. Focus on the achievements. Inspire patriotism. Don't dwell on the ugly parts. Others argue we need to confront the full complexity of our history, including the violence, the racism, the betrayals. Teach the uncomfortable truths. Don't sanitize the past. This debate is often framed as a binary choice. Either we celebrate America or we criticize it. Either we honor the founders or we condemn them. Either we teach traditional history or we engage in revisionism. But the forgotten founders show us this is a false choice. Because the complete story, the story that includes Mercy Otis Warren, George Mason, Samuel Adams, Phillis Wheatley, Crispus Attucks, and the Oneida Nation, isn't more divisive. It's more unifying. Here's why. When you acknowledge that America was built by a diverse coalition of people, radicals and moderates, men and women, wealthy and poor, white and black and Native American, you're no longer telling a story about one group's achievement. You're telling a story about collective action, about people with different backgrounds and different perspectives coming together around shared ideals, even when they disagreed about everything else. That story doesn't diminish the famous founders. It contextualizes them. It shows they were part of something larger than themselves. And it shows that the ideals they articulated, liberty, equality, self-governance, weren't invented by a handful of elite white men. They emerged from broader movements and conversations that included everyone. This is actually a more inspiring story than the mythology we've been taught, because it shows that ordinary people matter, that you don't need to be a Washington or a Jefferson to contribute to history. That collective action works. That movements change the world. Let me give you a specific example of why this matters right now. There's been enormous controversy about teaching American history in schools. Some states have passed laws restricting how teachers can discuss race, slavery, and historical injustice. The argument is that teaching these topics makes students feel guilty or ashamed about being American. But that argument only makes sense if you believe American history is the exclusive property of one racial group. If you believe America was built only by white people, then teaching about slavery and injustice might feel like an attack on that group's legacy. But if you understand that America was always multiracial, always collaborative, always contested, if you know about Phillis Wheatley and Crispus Attucks and the Oneida Nation, then teaching about slavery and injustice doesn't attack anyone's legacy. It's part of the complete story. It's acknowledging that some people who contributed to the founding were simultaneously being oppressed by it. That's not divisive. That's just true. And here's what's powerful about that truth. It shows that America's ideals have always been larger than America's reality. The declaration that all men are created equal was written by a slaveholder. Yes. But it was also read and embraced by enslaved people like Phillis Wheatley, who used those words to argue for their own freedom. The ideals were aspirational from the beginning. The founding generation didn't fully live up to them, but they created a framework that future generations could use to demand justice. Frederick Douglass understood this. In his famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" he didn't reject the founding ideals. He embraced them and said, "You've declared these principles. Now live up to them. Extend them to everyone." That's been the pattern of American progress ever since, not abandoning the founding ideals, but expanding them, insisting they apply to everyone, not just to the people who first articulated them. The forgotten founders are part of that story. Mercy Otis Warren argued that when government becomes tyrannical, resistance is justified. That principle didn't stop being true once the revolution was won. Every subsequent movement for justice, abolition, women's suffrage, civil rights, LGBT rights, has drawn from that same principle. George Mason insisted on explicit constitutional protections for individual rights. Every time Americans have defended those rights against government overreach, they've vindicated Mason's vision. Samuel Adams showed that grassroots organizing can challenge entrenched power. Every social movement since has followed his playbook. This is why reclaiming the forgotten founders isn't about tearing down the famous ones. It's about showing continuity. It's about demonstrating that the ideals Americans claim to value, liberty, equality, self-governance, have always belonged to everyone, not just to a select few. And it's about empowering people today to see themselves as part of that tradition. You want to organize your community around an issue you care about? Samuel Adams showed you how. You want to use art and culture to challenge injustice? Mercy Otis Warren and Phillis Wheatley showed you how. You want to take a principled stand even when it's unpopular? George Mason showed you how. You want to support a cause even when you're not part of the majority group benefiting from it? The Oneida Nation showed you how. These stories aren't ancient history. They're templates for action right now. But we've been denied these templates because the forgotten founders were systematically erased. We've been taught a passive version of history where great men make great decisions and ordinary people just benefit from their genius. That version of history doesn't inspire action. It inspires passivity. It teaches you to wait for the next great leader rather than becoming an agent of change yourself. The complete story, the one that includes everyone who contributed to the founding, teaches the opposite lesson. It teaches that you matter, that your voice matters, that your actions matter, that history is made by people exactly like you who decided to organize, to speak up, to resist, to contribute. And that's not just inspiring on an individual level, it's essential on a collective level. Because the challenges we face right now, climate change, economic inequality, political polarization, threats to democracy, these can't be solved by individual heroes. They require collective action, sustained organizing, and broad coalitions. Just like the founding did. Think about it. The American Revolution succeeded because it was a coalition effort. Wealthy merchants like John Hancock, who funded the resistance. Intellectuals like Mercy Otis Warren, who provided ideological framework. Organizers like Samuel Adams, who built grassroots networks. Soldiers like George Washington, who commanded the army. Diplomats like Benjamin Franklin, who secured international support. Working people who boycotted British goods. Enslaved people like Phillis Wheatley, who challenged revolutionary hypocrisy. Native Americans like the Oneida Nation, who provided crucial assistance. That's how you win a revolution. Not through one great leader, through coalition building, through diverse people contributing different skills and resources toward a common goal. And that's how you address the challenges of 2025. Not by waiting for the perfect candidate or the brilliant solution. By organizing. By building coalitions. By contributing whatever you can contribute, whether that's ideas, money, labor, artistic expression, or just showing up. The forgotten founders teach us that this is how change happens. Always has been. Always will be. Now, let's go deeper into the network, because we've talked about the most prominent forgotten founders, Warren, Mason, Adams, Wheatley, Attucks, the Oneida. But the network was even larger than that. There were dozens of people whose contributions shaped the founding and whose names have been completely lost. Let me tell you about James Otis Jr., Mercy Otis Warren's brother, a lawyer whose arguments against British taxation provided the intellectual foundation for revolutionary resistance. In 1761, Otis argued a case against writs of assistance, general search warrants that allowed British officials to search colonists' homes without specific cause. He lost the case legally, but his argument was so powerful that John Adams later wrote, "Then and there the child independence was born." Otis argued that the writs violated English common law, that government power must be limited by law, that even Parliament couldn't pass unjust legislation. These arguments became central to revolutionary ideology. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizure? That's James Otis's legacy. But Otis's story has a tragic ending. In 1769, he got into a fight with a British customs official and suffered a head injury. He spent the last years of his life struggling with mental illness, dying in 1783 when he was struck by lightning. His early brilliance was forgotten, his later struggles remembered. It was easier to forget him than to grapple with the tragedy of his decline. Then there's Caesar Rodney, Delaware delegate who, despite suffering from cancer and asthma, rode 80 miles through the night to reach Philadelphia and break Delaware's delegation deadlock, allowing the state to vote for independence. Without Rodney's vote, Delaware would have been split, potentially derailing the unanimous declaration that gave the revolution its legitimacy. Rodney knew he was dying. The ride through the rain made him worse, but he went anyway because he understood how crucial that moment was. He died in 1784, his face disfigured by cancer, largely forgotten by history. We don't teach about Rodney because his story is uncomfortable, dying, disfigured, suffering for a cause. We prefer our founders healthy, triumphant, victorious. Or consider Sybil Ludington, 16-year-old girl who, in 1777, rode 40 miles through the night to alert militia forces that British troops were attacking. She covered twice the distance Paul Revere did, through more dangerous territory, and successfully mustered the militia that helped repel the British. But we remember Paul Revere, immortalized in Longfellow's poem. We forget Sybil Ludington. Why? Same reason we forget Mercy Otis Warren. The mythology required male heroes. A teenage girl riding through the night didn't fit the template, so her story was quietly set aside. There's Wentworth Cheswill, black teacher and landowner in New Hampshire who served as a messenger like Paul Revere, alerting communities about British troop movements. He later became one of the first Black Americans elected to public office. His contribution to the Revolution was identical to Revere's, but Revere became a legend. Cheswill was forgotten. The racial component of that erasure is impossible to ignore. And Haym Salomon, Jewish immigrant from Poland who became one of the Revolution's primary financiers. When the Continental Congress was broke, and they were constantly broke, Salomon lent them money, brokered deals, used his international connections to secure funds. He died penniless in 1785 because the debts owed to him were never repaid. The Revolution literally could not have been financed without Jewish merchants like Salomon, but this fact complicated the narrative of a Christian founding, so it was minimized. Are you seeing the pattern? The network of people who made the revolution possible was vast and diverse. Every person I've mentioned, and there are dozens more, made essential contributions. But they've been forgotten or minimized because they didn't fit the mythology we constructed about the founding. This mythology serves a purpose, but it comes at a cost. The cost is historical accuracy, yes, But more importantly, the cost is inspiration. When we reduce the founding to a handful of great men, we lose the inspiring reality that ordinary people made the revolution. That collective action works. That you don't need to be Washington or Jefferson to change history. We lose the understanding that movements require diverse participants with different skills. You need the intellectuals like Warren and Mason. You need the organizers like Samuel Adams. You need the financiers like Haym Salomon. You need the messengers like Rodney and Ludington and Cheswell. You need the soldiers, the activists, the artists, the supporters. Everyone contributes something different, and the sum is greater than any individual part. This is the lesson modern movements have had to relearn, often painfully. The civil rights movement understood it. Martin Luther King Jr. was the famous face, but the movement was built by thousands of organizers, activists, ordinary people who boycotted buses, sat at lunch counters, registered voters. King himself constantly emphasized this, insisting that he was just one part of a larger movement. But our cultural tendency is to reduce movements to individuals, to remember King and forget the countless others who made the civil rights movement possible. We do this because it's simpler. It's easier to remember one name than thousands. It's easier to tell a story about a hero than about a complex social movement. But that simplicity comes at the cost of truth and inspiration. When we reduce movements to individuals, we misunderstand how change happens. And we make it harder for future movements to succeed because people don't understand that they need to build coalitions, organize communities, contribute their specific skills to a collective effort. The forgotten founders could teach us these lessons, but only if we remember them, only if we tell their stories, only if we complicate the simple mythology we've inherited and embrace the messy, beautiful, complex reality of how America actually came to be. So let's talk about what that reality looked like. Let's talk about how these networks actually functioned, because this is where it gets really interesting. The forgotten founders weren't just isolated individuals who happened to contribute to the revolution. They were connected. They influenced each other. They built on each other's ideas. Take the relationship between Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams. These two women corresponded regularly. They discussed political philosophy, revolutionary strategy, and women's rights. When John Adams was away, which was often, Abigail consulted with Mercy. They challenged each other's thinking, refined each other's arguments, and both of them pushed their husbands to think more expansively about rights and representation. Abigail's famous letter to John, "Remember the ladies," didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of conversation with women like Mercy Otis Warren, who were articulating arguments for women's political participation. John Adams dismissed his wife's letter, writing back that men knew better than to give up their authority. But Abigail's argument didn't die. It circulated through networks of women, was refined and expanded, and eventually became the foundation for the women's suffrage movement. The straight line from Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony is clear if you know where to look. Or consider the relationship between Samuel Adams and Joseph Warren. Joseph Warren was a doctor, a revolutionary activist, and one of Samuel Adams's closest collaborators. While Samuel built the organizational infrastructure, Joseph provided medical care to activists, used his professional status to gather intelligence, and coordinated with other colonies. When Paul Revere rode to warn of British troop movements, he was carrying a message from Joseph Warren. Warren died at the Battle of Bunker Hill, killed while rallying troops. He was one of the first prominent revolutionaries to die in combat. Samuel Adams was devastated, but he also understood that Warren's death could be used to inspire others. He organized commemorations, commissioned tributes, turned Warren into a martyr for the cause. This was the network in action. Different people playing different roles, coordinating their efforts, amplifying each other's contributions. When one member died, others picked up their work and honored their memory. This is how movements sustain themselves across time, how they survive setbacks and losses. Or look at the connection between George Mason and James Madison. Mason was the elder statesman, the principled idealist who insisted on explicit protection for individual rights. Madison was younger, more pragmatic, more politically astute. When Mason refused to sign the Constitution, Madison initially disagreed with him. Madison thought the Constitution was fine as drafted. But over the next 2 years, Madison watched the ratification debates. He saw how much opposition there was to the Constitution's concentration of federal power. He saw that Mason's concerns were shared by millions of Americans. And he recognized that without addressing those concerns, the Constitution might not survive. So Madison crafted the Bill of Rights, drawing heavily from Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. He took Mason's principled stand and translated it into political reality. This is how networks function. The idealist and the pragmatist need each other. The principled stand creates moral authority. The pragmatic implementation makes that principle real. Mason and Madison never fully reconciled. Mason remained bitter that his concerns had been dismissed initially, but Madison vindicated Mason's vision. The Bill of Rights is proof that sometimes the person who says no to a flawed compromise is more valuable than the person who says yes. And this brings us to a crucial question. What if we'd remembered these networks? What if American education emphasized collaborative effort instead of individual genius? What if we taught students that change comes from building coalitions, organizing communities, and contributing diverse skills? We'd have a more accurate understanding of history. We'd have more inspiration for collective action, and we'd have a better framework for addressing modern challenges. Because look at the problems we face. Climate change can't be solved by one brilliant scientist or one visionary leader. It requires collective action, scientists researching solutions, activists organizing communities, politicians crafting policy, business leaders investing in green technology, ordinary people changing consumption patterns. Everyone contributing different skills toward a common goal. Economic inequality can't be solved by one perfect tax plan or one charismatic politician. It requires sustained organizing, coalition building between workers and other marginalized groups, persistent pressure on institutions, cultural shifts in how we think about wealth and fairness. Political polarization can't be solved by one unifying candidate or one perfect speech. It requires people reaching across divides, building relationships, finding common ground, creating spaces for dialogue. All of these challenges require the exact skills the forgotten founders exemplified: organization, coalition building, diverse perspectives, sustained effort, willingness to contribute whatever you can contribute, even if you're not the famous face of the movement. But we don't teach these skills because we don't teach the history that demonstrates their effectiveness. We teach about individual genius instead. We teach students to admire Washington and Jefferson, which is fine, but we don't teach them to emulate Warren and Adams and Mason. We don't show them that ordinary people organized and made change happen. This is the cost of the erasure, not just historical inaccuracy, not just the loss of inspiring stories, but the loss of practical knowledge about how change actually happens, the loss of templates for action. And in 2025, when Americans are more politically engaged than they've been in decades, when social movements are reshaping the political landscape, when people are organizing around issues from climate to healthcare to democracy itself, we need those templates. We need to understand how the forgotten founders built networks, sustained movements, and achieved revolutionary change. So let me give you some practical lessons from the forgotten founders, real takeaways you can apply right now. Lesson 1, from Mercy Otis Warren. Use culture to change politics. Warren understood that plays, poems, and stories shape how people think about power and justice. She didn't just write political treatises. She wrote entertaining plays that made complex ideas accessible and emotionally resonant. Modern movements understand this. Think about how art, music, and storytelling have been central to every major social movement. Culture isn't secondary to politics. It's how you change hearts and minds. Lesson 2, from Samuel Adams. Build infrastructure before you need it. Adams spent years creating the committees of correspondence, building networks, establishing communication channels. When the crisis came, the infrastructure was ready. Modern organizing works the same way. You don't start organizing when disaster hits. You build community relationships, create networks, establish trust in advance. Then, when you need to mobilize, you can. Lesson 3, from George Mason. Principle matters more than popularity. Mason refused to compromise on individual rights, even when it cost him politically. He was proven right. Sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is say no to a flawed compromise and hold out for something better. Not every no succeeds, but principled opposition creates space for future progress. Lesson 4, from Phillis Wheatley. Your voice matters even when, especially when, others try to silence it. Wheatley was enslaved, yet she used her brilliance to challenge the revolution's hypocrisy. She proved through her own existence that the arguments for natural equality were true. When people try to exclude you from the conversation, your participation becomes revolutionary. Lesson 5, from the Oneida Nation. Solidarity across difference is possible and powerful. The Oneida didn't have to support the revolution. They chose to. They contributed what they could: food, supplies, warriors, at a crucial moment. Building coalitions requires reaching across lines of difference, finding common cause even when you don't agree on everything. That's how you build movements large enough to win. These lessons aren't abstract historical observations. They're practical guidelines for action right now. Whatever cause you care about, whatever change you want to see, these lessons apply. Want to address climate change? Build networks like Samuel Adams. Use culture like Mercy Otis Warren. Stand on principle like George Mason. Amplify marginalized voices like Phillis Wheatley. Build coalitions across difference like the Oneida Nation. Want to defend democracy? Same lessons. Want to fight economic inequality? Same lessons. Want to advance civil rights? Same lessons. The forgotten founders aren't just historical figures who deserve recognition. They're teachers. Their methods worked. They changed the world. And their methods still work today. But here's the challenge. To learn from them, you have to know about them. And most Americans don't. The erasure has been so complete that even people who consider themselves historically informed have never heard these names or learned these lessons. That's why this documentary matters. That's why telling these stories is essential. Not to diminish the famous founders, not to make anyone feel guilty about incomplete education, but to provide the complete toolkit, to show that the tradition of American activism is broader, more diverse, and more inspiring than the mythology suggests. And to empower you, yes, you watching this, to see yourself as part of that tradition. You don't need to be Washington or Jefferson. You can be Warren or Adams or Mason. You can contribute ideas, organization, principle. You can build networks, create culture, stand on values. You can be part of a collective effort that changes history. Because that's how history actually changes, not through isolated geniuses, through people exactly like you who decide to contribute whatever they can contribute, who organize their communities, who speak truth to power, who build coalitions, who sustain movements across time. The forgotten founders prove this. Their erasure doesn't change the fact that they changed history. It just means we need to do the work of recovery. We need to excavate their stories, learn their lessons, and apply them today. And that brings us to the final question. Where do we go from here? How do we move from acknowledging erasure to reclaiming these stories? How do we ensure that future generations learn the complete history, not just the simplified mythology? The answer is both simple and challenging. We tell the stories. We insist on complete history. We push back against simplistic narratives. We demand that education include everyone who contributed, not just the famous few. We support historians doing recovery work. We create documentaries, books, articles, social media content that brings forgotten founders into public consciousness. But more than that, we apply their lessons. We organize like Samuel Adams. We write like Otis Warren. We stand on principle like George Mason. We challenge power like Phillis Wheatley. We build coalitions like the Oneida Nation. We become the next generation of people whose contributions might be forgotten, but whose impact will last forever. Because here's the ultimate truth. Most people who change history are forgotten. That's just reality. The historians can't remember everyone. The mythology requires simplification, but forgetting doesn't erase impact. The work still matters. The change still happens. The world still shifts. Mercy Otis Warren died in 1814. By then, she'd been largely forgotten by the public. But her ideas lived on in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, in the tradition of American political thought. She wasn't famous, but she was successful. George Mason died in 1792. He never held high office. He refused to sign the Constitution. But 2 years later, they added the Bill of Rights, his Bill of Rights. He wasn't celebrated, but he was vindicated. Samuel Adams died in 1803. By then, he was old, out of step with politics, largely retired from public life. But the organizing techniques he pioneered were being used by the next generation of activists. He wasn't honored, but he was influential. Phillis Wheatley died in 1784, poor and largely forgotten. But her poems continued to be read, to challenge people's assumptions, to prove that genius has nothing to do with race or status. She wasn't wealthy or famous, but she was right. The Oneida Nation was betrayed by the country they helped create. Their lands were seized. Their people were displaced. But they survived. They maintained their identity. They're still here today, still fighting for justice, still demanding recognition. They weren't rewarded, but they persevered. This is the pattern of the forgotten founders. They contributed. They changed history. They weren't properly recognized, but their work mattered. The impact lasted, and that should be both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because it reminds us that recognition doesn't equal significance, that fame doesn't equal impact, that you can change the world and still be forgotten, but inspiring because it proves that your contributions matter regardless of whether you're remembered, that doing the work is its own reward, that changing history doesn't require becoming famous. Most people watching this documentary won't become famous. That's just statistics. But you can contribute to change. You can organize your community. You can support important causes. You can speak up for justice. You can build coalitions. You can create culture. You can do the work. And maybe in 200 years, no one will remember your name. But the world will still be better because you existed, because you contributed, because you did the work. That's what the forgotten founders teach us. Not that we should seek recognition, but that we should contribute regardless of whether we're recognized. That collective action matters. That movements work. That ordinary people change history. So here's my challenge to you. Take one lesson from the forgotten founders and apply it this week. Just one. Maybe it's reaching out to build a coalition with someone who thinks differently than you do. Maybe it's using your artistic talents to communicate about an issue you care about. Maybe it's taking a principled stand on something, even when it's unpopular. Maybe it's amplifying a marginalized voice. Maybe it's organizing your community around a local issue. Just one action. One small contribution to making the world better. That's all it takes to join the tradition of the forgotten founders. Not fame, not recognition, just contribution. And if enough people do that, if enough people take one lesson from the forgotten founders and apply it, we'll build the networks and movements necessary to address the challenges of our time. Just like they built the networks and movements necessary to address the challenges of theirs. The forgotten founders aren't dead history. They're living teachers. Their lessons still work. Their methods still succeed. Their tradition still continues. You're part of that tradition whether you know it or not. Every time you organize, activate, participate, contribute, you're following in their footsteps. So the next time someone tells you they know the real story of America's founding, ask them, which version? The sanitized textbook myth? Or the complex, uncomfortable, beautiful truth? History isn't a fixed narrative. It's an ongoing investigation. And you, yes, you watching this, are now part of that investigation. Question everything. Seek primary sources. Demand the complete story. Challenge mythologies. Insist on complexity. Recognize contributions that have been erased. Learn from forgotten founders. Apply their lessons. Because the forgotten founders deserve better than erasure. They deserve recognition. They deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their contributions acknowledged and their lessons learned. And you deserve the complete story. You deserve to know how change actually happens. You deserve to understand that ordinary people, people exactly like you, built this nation. That genius isn't limited to famous men. That collective action works. That your contributions matter. You deserve to see yourself in American history, not as a passive observer, not as someone waiting for great leaders to save us, but as an active participant in an ongoing story, as someone whose contributions can change the world, even if your name is eventually forgotten. That's what we've lost by erasing the forgotten founders, not just their individual stories, but the understanding that history is made by people like us, by ordinary people who organize and contribute and persist, by networks and movements, not by isolated geniuses. We can reclaim that understanding. We can tell the complete story. We can learn the lessons. We can apply the methods. We can continue the tradition. The forgotten founders started something bigger than themselves, something that lasted beyond their recognition, something that changed the world. Now it's our turn. We know their stories now. We've learned their lessons. We understand their methods. The question is, will we follow their example? Will we contribute? organize, persist. Will we build the networks and movements necessary to address our challenges? Will we become the forgotten founders of our own era? The people whose names might not be remembered, but whose contributions changed history? That's up to you. The forgotten founders have taught you everything you need to know. They've shown you that change is possible, that ordinary people matter, that collective action works. Now do the work. Question everything. Organize communities. Build coalitions. Create culture. Stand on principle. Amplify marginalized voices. Contribute whatever you can contribute. Be a forgotten founder. Not for recognition, not for fame, but because the work matters. Because change is necessary. Because history is watching, even if it forgets your name. The forgotten founders are waiting. Their tradition continues. Their methods still work. Their lessons still inspire. Will you join them? That's the question this documentary leaves you with. Not, did you learn something? But, what will you do with what you've learned? The forgotten founders changed history. Now it's your turn. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for recognition. Don't wait for the perfect moment or the perfect leader. Just start. Organize. Contribute. Persist. Become a forgotten founder. Change history. The story continues. And you're part of it now. Whether history remembers your name or not. Subscribe to Golden History USA for more untold stories buried in primary sources. Next week, we're investigating the private letters George Washington tried to destroy. The correspondence that reveals the man behind the mythology, complete with doubts, fears, and compromises that complicate the legend. Hit that bell icon so you don't miss it. Because if the forgotten founders taught us anything, it's that the complete story is always more interesting than the mythology. And there are hundreds more stories waiting to be excavated from the archives. The investigation continues, and you're part of it now. Thank you for watching. Now go make history.